Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Before we do get started, I do want to let you know that this program is being recorded and it will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum website and YouTube page after this presentation. I want to welcome everyone back to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's virtual lecture series talking about race matters. Join the conversation. My name is Melissa Kievit, and I am the Executive Director here at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. We are delighted to continue this lecture series that began in August of 2020. The series was so successful that we've continued it as a biannual series. So thank you to those who have returned and welcome to our newcomers. This series was created at a time of great unrest in this country due to the murder of unarmed Black people, as well as the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our goal throughout has been to encourage people to come together and engage in conversation on a topic that can sometimes be uncomfortable. This session of Talking About Race Matters is a 3-week series centered around fashion and creative self-expression. Our presenters will explore these topics, beginning with the period of enslavement in the United States and ending with present-day influences in fashion. I do want to point out a few things about Zoom to ensure that your questions and comments are answered. If you have any technical assistance questions, you can ask Caroline, our digital content and programs manager, using the Q&A feature. If you do use the chat, it might get missed, so please do put it in the Q&A feature. And then during the lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please also use the Q&A section, and we will answer those questions at the end. The Dyckman Farmhouse Museum would like to thank everyone for participating in our first presentation of this spring's Talking About Race Matters lecture series. The overwhelming response for this lecture series makes it clear that there is a need for platforms that allow us to talk about issues that divide us and issues that unite us as Americans. The Dyckman team believes our programming should be accessible to all. This means we strive to make as many of our programs as possible free of charge. As a small nonprofit organization, we rely on grants and donations to support this mission. So tonight we are joined by Cheyney McKnight, manager of Living History at the New York Historical Society. And during this program, Cheyney will give a lecture on headwraps found among both free and enslaved African women in America from the 18th and 19th century. Attendees will learn how headwraps changed from region to region and the culture and historical significance of styles. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Cheyney McKnight presenting headwraps of African women in America.
Hi, thank you so much, Melissa. Once again, it is an honor to do work with Dyckman Farmhouse, and I look forward to doing more work with you all. Now, to start, just a little introduction of who I am. My day job is kind of working at New York Historical Society, but I own and operate Not Your Mama's History YouTube channel, as well as consulting firm where we go from site to site and help sites to talk about the history of race in America and North America. So I am a historical interpreter, a historian, and when I started, I specialized in the clothing of enslaved women, and that soon expanded to talking about the clothing of almost all Black women in North America. But there's always more to learn. I'm constantly learning. So this is kind of my shameless plug. If you have paintings or drawings of Black women in the 18th or 19th century, please reach out to me. If you think that I haven't seen it or it's not well known, please reach out to me through email. And you can find that on our Instagram, YouTube channel, Not Your Mama's History, and share with us, because the more images we have, the more of a picture we can paint of what clothing and look like in the 18th and 19th century for these women. So when I started to do living history, I started in the reenacting world as a hobby. And then I went into work in museums, and then I became a professional historical interpreter. When I first started in the hobby section, in the hobby as a reenactor, I was trying to figure out what my kit would look like, my clothing that I would wear to specifically Civil War events. And what I got from people was Black women wore the cheaper versions of what white women were wearing. And I just knew from just being Black in America, that was not true. So from that point on, my goal was to learn as much as I could and do as much research as possible into what the clothing of Black women look like. And then early on, I found out that even though there was a lot of, I would say, some academia within the academic world about Black women in this era, there weren't a lot of people really delving into the specifics of head wraps. And what I discovered early on was that there was a vast diversity of head wraps. And a lot of what we know about head wraps of enslaved women specifically is really linked to 1940s, 50s Hollywood and minstrel shows. And to be clear, minstrel shows are America's first cultural export. So when most people around the world think of Black American women in head wraps, they are working from a basis of minstrel shows. So I really had to start picking the knot of what is real, what is actual historical, and what is fiction kind of raveled up in minstrel shows. And so that's where I started. So I asked that at the beginning of most of my presentations, I asked that you kind of throw away everything you think you know about 18th and 19th century head wraps and start from the basics. Next slide. So the basics would be, first, let's take a look at the scope. We're really looking from 18th century on up to present today, yes, and the future, because I do not like to start, I do not like to stop in the past, but bring it all the way forward to the present, because why does it matter that we're even doing this work? And we are going to start in West Africa. Next slide. There was a vast diversity of the Black experience in North America. I know that there is a lot of influences in Black American clothing during this period, from the West Indies and from Africa, because they're, especially in the 18th century, before the end of the official end of the international slave trade, there was a constant influx of enslaved persons from the West Indies, as well as West Africa, into North America. So you'll see a lot of that present, but I am focusing on North American Black folks. Next slide. And number one rule is there are no rules. I find that as soon as you say they would have never done this, or that never happened, or they didn't have this, or they didn't do that, you can find an example to the contrary. What I usually say is there are a lot of examples of this from here, here, and here, or there aren't a lot of examples of that. But if you find it, please let me know. Again, if you find examples that are not present here, please feel free to share. We're always open to discovering more. Next slide. I think it is really important to start with talking about the base of Black hair, because there's a reason why head wraps were a bit more prevalent during enslavement in this country. There are a lot of reasons for that. And so we're going to start unraveling that. But we want to start first in exploring and understanding Black hair. And to start, the hair of people of African descent is very diverse. But today I'm specifically talking about kinky coily hair. But I want to acknowledge that there is a vast diversity of hair amongst Black Americans. But we're going to focus really on some of the traits of kinky coily hair. To be clear, all hair needs to be cleaned and groomed. However, we're specifically talking about these hair types. Kinky coily hair, commonly referred to as Afro textured hair or kinky hair or coily hair or just curly hair. It naturally can be drier, not because Black hair does not have sebum oil, the oil that comes from our scalp, everyone's scalp. It just takes longer on really tightly coiled hair for the oil to get from the roots all the way down. It appears denser, but kinky coily hair can be soft and fine or coarse and wiry. So, and there can be a combination of them, just like any other hair texture. Strands can be very tight, small curls or zigzags. So you can kind of see some here, and they can be a combination of these. My hair is a combination of tightly coils and zigzags. It is so much fun during detangling. It is prone to shrinkage, which means that the hair, when it dries, it shrinks toward the scalp and makes the hair look denser and shorter, but no less beautiful. Kinky coily hair is very versatile, and I am very lucky that this is my hair that grows out of my head. I find that with kinky coily hair, resources, time, and knowledge are so key. And this is why we have to delve into African routines. Next slide. West Africa is a very diverse place. There are thousands of ethnic groups that have their own customs and traditions. There's really no way for me to really go through hundreds, not thousands of ethnic groups independently, individually, and really explain to you the vast diversity of hair grooming rituals and traditions. So I'll be doing a lot of generalizations, but I really encourage you to really delve into the diversity of West Africa and start learning about different tribes and ethnic groups. Might I throw out a few right now? The Yoruba, the Igbo, please go and explore. Hair grooming is was a communal activity, still is, that encourages community bonding, an important part of the transition into adulthood for both boys and girls. Usually, again, I'm generalizing, but a child is sat between the knees of the elders, and they will transition their hairstyle, whether it's through braids, cuts, twist, or a different hairstyle in combing. And they'll tell them all the things that they need to know during this transition period into adulthood, along with other community rituals. Along with these vast diversity of hairstyling, braids, twists, cornrows, side shaves, cut designs, beading, beaded in hoops, mud molds. Again, over so many different hairstyles we can go into. Hair stretching is a thing. I talked to you about shrinkage. So using different techniques such as threading, wrapping a string tightly around the hair to stretch it, to do different types of styles. And there are lots of skilled grooming rituals. You probably have seen Black women today in America with braids or cornrows. Most likely they went to a skilled braider that may have learned that from another braider, whether it's in their family or not. Next slide. I just wanted to go through and just show a few images of African women and their hairstyles. Next slide. And next slide. Next slide. So a lot of hair grooming styles throughout West Africa start with a base style, whether it is a cut or cornrows or some type of braid twist. And then sometimes it's built. The next stage is there is a style built on that base style. And then sometimes there's adornment added onto that built out base. Next slide. So now we're going to jump into head wraps of West Africa. So we've gotten from the base, what is underneath the head wraps, to actual head wraps. Next slide. There are many different words throughout Africa for the head tie, the head wrap. Here in America, you will hear a lot of people use head wrap or head scarf or head tie, but I hear a lot of head wrap. I use head wrap. That's what's comfortable to me. My family in South Carolina, they use head rag or rag because sometimes there were actual rags used. So something that was used over and over again, and they washed it, and they threw it on their head for cleaning purposes. So here we have in Zimbabwe, you may hear duku. Nigeria, the Yoruba use gele. You probably hear that a lot. The Igbo, ichafu. Ghanaians, duku. And Botswana, I will murder this, tukwi. And casa akaye. Next slide. There are many different meanings for head wraps throughout West Africa. The main one, it looks good, it's very stylish, but going from ethnic group to ethnic group, you'll see the meaning change. For some people coming of age, they start wearing a head wrap. For certain events. They may wear head wraps. Some show marital status by head wraps. Some Muslim women use head wraps to cover their head instead of other traditional head coverings. To show respect, to show that you have been engaged during a wedding. I know that sometimes when a newly wedded woman goes to see her in-laws for the first time, she's expected to cover her head during death, because when you are grieving, your hair may become unkempt, just because through grief you don't focus on your hair or keeping yourself clean. So you see head wraps as well. Weddings, you see a lot of galas at weddings. They're always so beautiful and big. Next slide. Okay. This is one of my favorite prints. Number one, I find that it is very rare when you see an image in a Western book that is not a caricature. This is a Yoruba mother and child. Next slide. Now, this is one of my favorite artists, David Bolet. He was a Senegalese artist, and he really did a lot of portraits in the Senegambia region, and it depicted a lot of the prominent fashion in those areas. I really like his images because it really shows the importance of having artists from those cultures painting these people. You see less objectification of these subjects, and a lot more humanity is shown. And I find that he puts in a lot more detail that is important to his specific culture. Next slide. A Wolof woman here. And then you'll see these are very similar in style. Next slide. Again, a really beautiful image here. And you can kind of see two different takes. Again, this is also 30 years apart, something that I think a lot of people forget when looking at cultures outside our own, is that we forget that just like in our culture, fashions change. And among African women, fashions change so fast. So I really like kind of figuring out how this fashion changed in just a 30-year period. You can see the differences in silhouettes, as well as fabric choices. Next slide. Monday. Now we're going to really jump into what head wraps in North America look like. Now that we've covered what is kind of the source materials as far as head wraps of African women, we can see how did they adapt to life of enslavement, as well as life as second-class citizens for Black women who were free. Next slide. Something that really shocked me when I started doing my research was that there weren't a lot of laws actually mandating clothing. What I did find was a handful of laws governing the clothing of enslaved persons and free Black people. One thing that I really want to point out is that there were a lot of laws that were passed mandating that people had to clothe their enslaved persons. This meant that enslavers were not clothing people. So there were many laws that were passed from the late 17th century on about having to mandating that enslavers had to clothe their enslaved persons. Now I'm sorry if you can hear sirens going off. Some of the laws that I did find was South Carolina's Negro Act of 1735. There was an amendment later passed. Having or wearing any sort of garment or apparel whatsoever, finer, other, or of greater value than Negro cloth, duffels, coarse kersey, osnaburg, blue linen, check linen, or coarse garlics, or calicos, check cottons, or Scottish plaids. I find this interesting, especially the conversations that come up around this particular law. This was passed during colonial governor William Bull's time in the province of South Carolina. It was in response to the Stono rebellions. The amendment itself was in response to the Stono rebellions in 1739. I find this is a combination of wanting enslaved persons to be more visible, wanting them to know their place, as well as conflict with status and cultural status. There was a lot of friction as well between people who were considered less than in society than those who are wealthier. So it would have been considered inappropriate to wear the same garment that someone who was considered their betters to be wearing. So there's a lot of things happening. There's racism. There's wanting to control enslaved and indentured labor. And there's also social morals. Then the Tignon laws of 1786, passed by Governor Miro of New Orleans. And he passed a series of laws governing the dress of women of color, both enslaved and free. And it was very specific to New Orleans. It requires their hair be bound in a kerchief, refrain from excessive attention to dress, banned from wearing plumes or jewelry. And we know a lot of these laws really failed because these African women were very creative, and they were like, okay, we're going to find every loophole in these laws. And pretty soon they were wearing plumes shooting out of head wraps, as well as adorning these tignons with gems and jewels, and you will see an image of that. I find that a lot of these laws were very unsuccessful wherever you see them, because enslavement in this country relied on a punishment reward system, and clothing was very important to this punishment reward system put in place by enslavers as a way to control enslaved persons. And then also just it was really impossible to govern people, especially on large plantations, in this manner. Next slide. So the purpose of head wraps. just simply lack of time and resources. I know that there's a lot of conversations right now going on specifically on Instagram and TikTok about whether we need all these things to care for our hair. Do you need butters and jams and jellies and all these things that we purchase for our hair? But really looking at West African hair care routines, yes, you don't need all these things, but you do need things for molding the hair, caring for the hair, cleaning the hair. And those who were enslaved, kidnapped, and brought here were unable to bring a lot of what they use to care for their hair. They also weren't given the time or the resources to properly care for their hair. And some of the children who were brought here, especially when we're looking at places like here in the North, where you see children isolated away from other Africans, they're also not getting the resources on learning how to properly care for their hair. So you also see a lot of shorn hair, a lot of hair loss, just because they either don't have the time, they don't have access to the resources, the combs and the butters to properly care for their hair. And also when children are isolated, they're unable to do their own hair. Now, one thing that I've found is that my head wrap is integral to aiding in my head carry. So when I am carrying baskets or buckets on my head wraps are really good at stabilizing the donut I put on my head to then carry my basket. It keeps the hair clean and neat. And it also aids in hair stretching to achieve certain European style hairstyles when you're working on natural hair. Remember, they did not have access, thank goodness, to a lot of the straightening methods that we have today, which also takes a lot of time. And a lot of enslaved persons did not have that time. A lot of working class folks did not have that time. So what I found traditionally, when we're looking at both early and mid 19th century, both down south on plantations, as well as free and enslaved Black folks in the North. Usually Sunday evening is when washing, and they style the hair into a protective hairstyle under the head wrap. So a protective hairstyle would be twist or braids or cornrows or flat twist. You put the head wrap on and then you work through the week. And if you have twist or braids, if you need to style your hair out, you can take off the head wrap at any time and style your hair, because the hair will then be stretched and ready to be styled. And then so usually when you see someone with a head wrap in an image, underneath, the majority of what I see is not just the hair out. Sometimes you do see that, but usually the hair is braided or twisted or even stringed. So they have strings that they wrap around the strands that we talked about earlier underneath, and then a head tie is over that. And then Sunday morning, they undo it and they style it for church, or they'll just put on a nicer head wrap, sometimes a snowy white head wrap, or something that was specifically purchased for Sunday. We do know that in certain places here in North America, head wraps indicated marital status. And then one thing that is very common throughout North America, especially throughout the South is that head wraps were a racial identifier. I do get a lot of questions from costumers, especially white costumers, asking, would white women have worn head wraps? Yes, white women did wear head wraps, but they made sure that the style was very specific and not anywhere near what Black women were wearing. There are some exceptions when we're looking at Creole women, but usually white women would not have wanted to wear a garment that would identify them as a second-class citizen on the streets. It just really would not have been something that they would have voluntarily done. So you can look up and see some images of women, of white women with like a covering that ties under the neck or ties around the neck. But they're specific in their styling so that they are not mistaken. If you want to delve into Creole styles, that is a whole nother, there's a whole nother realm of scholarship, and there are people who do it and do it very well. Next slide. Okay. I forgot, I did have one quote in the last slide. I apologize for that. There is a quote from the WPA slave narratives. Ebenezer Brown of Mississippi, he said his mom would wrap her hair and tie it up in a cloth. My mom could tote a bucket of water on her head and never spill a drop. I seen her bring that milk in great big buckets from the pen on her head and never lose one drop. And that's from the Mississippi narratives. Next slide. So, how were they getting these fabrics? One that I see over and over again are allotments. You see lots and lots of descriptions of the choices of fabric of some enslaved women and free Black women. You see, I love reading the accounts of from travel journals. Also, reading letters from enslavers to other enslavers or advice columns. But what I found in general, there's sometimes an allotment of a handkerchief extra too per year in the allotment from enslavers. There's an anonymous Mississippi planter who wrote Management of Negroes Upon the Southern Estate in 1851. And he gives some notes that he gives 2 handkerchiefs extra to his enslaved property. Then there are accounts from enslaved persons as well who are talking about the different head wraps that were seen during enslavement. Lewis Hughes talks about seeing the women inside the households. They're wearing snowy white kerchiefs and sometimes on special occasions, brightly colored, what I perceive to be Madras plaids. And we'll talk about that a bit later. I also see clothing traded a lot between people. It's purchased. So Frederick Law Olmsted, in his account, Cotton Kingdom, he was a northern white man who traveled in the South before the American Civil War. And he talks about Black women wearing head wraps. He writes, the Negroes also purchased clothes for themselves. and I note especially, are well supplied with hand kerchiefs, which the men frequently and the women nearly always wear on their heads. So he sees them purchasing. You can also go to the records of stores and see what enslaved persons are purchasing and free Black folks are purchasing. And then we do have accounts of homespun. I do think that homespun fabric is a little bit exaggerated. We see a lot of enslavers are purchasing them bulk, the fabric bulk from places like Scotland. And they're actual Negro cloth manufacturers. So enslaved persons are getting a lot of these in allotments. Some handkerchiefs were cut from other fabrics. So a dress is worn out, so you can cut a piece out of that and use that as a head wrap. Okay, I am getting a little bit behind, so I'm going to jump ahead. Next slide. All right, so what are some of the fabrics? Oh my goodness. I just want to say first and foremost, everything. Enslaved and free Black women were wearing anything they could get their hands on and style appropriately on their heads. A few things that I found very common was that they were very paranoid about the cleanliness of the head wraps. And if they could clean them, they were getting cleaned to the point where usually the head wrap was more faded than the rest of the garment. They're almost always starched. And we'll get to that a bit later. There was something called Negro cloth. It is just a category. And these fabrics fell under other categories. But Negro cloths were just extremely cheap fabrics. And there are many different types. So when we're looking at the 18th century, Negro cloth is usually linen, and like the worst quality of linen. And I have a few samples of them, got my hands on a few samples of Negro cloth, and they are awful. Sometimes by the 19th century, they were printed. It could be checked, they could be striped. There's something called linsey woolsey. In the 18th century, it was linen and wool. By the 19th century, it was cotton. It was cotton and wool. And from all accounts, very, very itchy, very, very uncomfortable. But there is no one type of Negro cloth. It is just kind of this umbrella that manufacturers were selling to enslavers. So you come across it, it may say Negro cloth or slave cloth. But that's what it is if you see it. Again, some homespuns. And one thing that people were shocked, yes, enslaved women could get their hands on silk. If they're side hustles and side businesses, many of them had what I like to call a side hustle, where they were making money off of maybe selling vegetables that they had grown. In many places, chickens were the business of enslaved persons. George Washington purchased his chickens from enslaved persons, so that they are able to make some side money from those endeavors. So they were able to purchase things like better cotton, better linen, and wools, because a lot of allotments were not enough. And then anything and every adornment you can come up with, different colors, plain, checked, striped, printed, lace, bejeweled, embroidered, all types of colors. they were purchasing it. And you can also see the complaints in local newspapers about people being so frustrated by how colorful and they were. Next slide. Common colors that we see. There are some similarities within certain plantations, going from plantation to plantation and region to region. Also, where are enslavers purchasing their Negro cloths from will also determine. Also, what is available locally to the enslaved population to, as far as dyes. They were going out into the woods and collecting items to actually dye their fabrics as well. There's a lot of examples of that in the WPA narratives. We see white being used a lot within the household, but I find red was very, very much liked by enslaved persons. You see a lot of red kerchiefs, things like that. We have an account from Frances Kimball in her description of the clothing of enslaved women who were on their way to church or Sunday meeting. She writes, the grotesque Sunday costume of poor enslaved people on her husband's Georgia plantation. She writes, had handkerchiefs that put one's very eye out from a mile away. I think she was just jealous of the beauty of the head wraps, but this really shows just how brightly colored, as well as the styles that they were doing at the time, was very eye-catching, especially for outsiders. So the shapes of the head wraps I find the most common were kerchief sizes. They were square, usually, sometimes a triangle. So a kerchief just cut in half can make a very simple head wrap or a kerchief. And then I did come across some rectangles. So meaning when I'm looking at a image and I see how a woman has folded her head wrap or tied her head wrap, I can determine if it is a rectangle, a triangle, or a square based off of how much fabric there is and how it sits on the head. For example, if you look at my head wrap, if you can see me, this is a rectangle, and you can tell because it is very heavy on top. And I had a lot of fabric on these sides that I could tie up and get some volume. So we see, as I said before, in the transition from the 18th to 19th century and the invention of the cotton gin, there's a transition from linen to cotton. Next slide. Okay. Now I'm just going to go through and just show you for the rest of the time, show you some examples of head wraps across from the 18th century to today. All right, next slide. This is, I really wanted this to be the first one because I really wanted to debunk the idea that enslaved women always wore head wraps. They did not. There's so much evidence in the 18th and 19th century that a lot of women, Black women, went with absolutely without, especially if they were allotted nothing and their enslaver did not allow them to have side hustles. These women, you can see, they are only wearing Negro cloth. And this is clearly something allotted to them in their allotment. And they are not wearing head wraps or any other kerchief, any other adornment. And this says a lot. And this is an overseer doing his duty near Fredericksburg, Virginia. It's circa 1798. And this is, I have it down there, Benjamin Latrobe. Next slide. This is actually an older woman, but I find this very interesting because this hairstyle is very common. It's a very traditional braided up hairstyle in West Africa. And it's still done today. So it is braided up and the braids kind of come out the top there. Next slide. Now, I'm sorry, I was supposed to update this one. The slide is not updated. But I will actually send an updated one. I apologize for this. We'll go to the next slide. So this is a very common one. This is in the Colonial Williamsburg collection at the Abbey Aldridge Rockefeller Folk Art Museum. And you can go see it in person. This is a very interesting image. Number one, it is enslaved persons at leisure without white folks in frame, even though they are obviously being observed because they are being painted by either their enslaver or someone associated with their enslaver. This is really showing a time of leisure for them. So you'll notice both men and women are wearing head wraps. This is very common. Again, there are lots of descriptions backing this up that both men and women wore head wraps. And you will see a woman not wearing a head wrap. And you'll see some similarities between kerchiefs and head wraps. Especially in the West Indies at this time, it was very fashionable for your neckerchief to match your head wrap. So you saw a lot of styles like that. And you will also see different wrapping. These women are doing different wrapping. I do believe that there are two different styles, sizes present. The woman in the white to the right of the painting, who is next to the gentleman who's wearing a red jacket. I believe her head wrap is a smaller square. And the woman in the green, I believe that hers is a larger kerchief. Next slide. We'll get through all this. Okay, this is really exciting because I went to St. Kitts to do some research. And these head wraps are very unique to the West Indies and to this area. And so it's really nice to see a beautiful image of kind of similar styling, but pretty much the same on these two women. And these women are seamstresses. Next slide. And I'm sure many people are familiar with these images by this artist. These women are also from the West Indies, and they are wearing obviously kerchiefs and head wraps, and they are matching. And the style in the West Indies was height. And I think it should be noted, remember I talked about how styles shifted very rapidly throughout cultures around the world. And I find that it's interesting that as the height of fashions across Europe, hairstyles were going up, so were the head wraps here. But the style, I find that their styling, the height of the head wrap lasted a lot longer than the highest hairstyles in the 1770s. Next slide. Now we're going to take a look at the early 19th century, one of my favorite periods. Next slide. I kind of debate whether or not to put her in here because technically it's not a full head wrap, but I have seen the styling coming up. It's basically a headband there, but I found it very unique because this is a woman who's wearing her natural hair texture out without, her hair is styled, but it is not styled to be in a European style. And I thought that this image was very interesting. Next slide. And that's New York. Both of these are from New York. One of my favorite paintings, first because it is Mrs. Toussaint. Her husband was a hairstylist, very famous in New York City. But her head wrap was very popular style. It's a madras fabric, and these were made in India and imported all over. It was very popular in Western Europe. It was popular in Africa. So in the 16th century onward, you would see a lot of African women throughout coastal Africa wearing madras. And it was very integral to the different styles and different fashions as they ebbed and flowed. But madras was traded throughout for gold, salt, natural resources, and yes, people. So madras has a very complicated history. Next slide. Now, this is a very interesting painting. Actually, a lot has been discovered recently about this painting, about how things were kind of erased from this image. But her head wrap is very common for the early 19th century, especially in Mississippi and Louisiana, especially for free women of color. Next slide. Again, you see the continuation of the styling in Louisiana. I love the folds there on the side. This is a very simple head wrap, but it's very, you can style it very crisply. One thing that I forgot to mention was that Black women, I think all people during this time were obsessed with starch, starching your cuffs, your collars. But Black women would starch a head wrap to no end. I think that's the one thing we get wrong. Well, interpreters like myself get wrong about head wraps, is that we do not starch our head wraps enough. They should be starched to the point where I could take it off and set it on the table and it would stand up. I have seen enslaved women who had a threadbare head wrap. But if that head wrap could hold starch, they starched it and ironed it and put it on their head. Next slide. And this is also another common style in the early 19th century. See, I think that these are very similar to galays, the way in which it is tied. So these, whereas my head wrap, when I put it on, I start from the front and in the middle, whereas in galays, you usually start from the end and you start wrapping, and then you tie it. So I think these are very similar to West African galas. Next slide. Again, with the madras. And you'll see this is definitely starched the way it's sitting on her head. You can see that this is starched. If she picked this off her head, it could keep its shape and she could set it on a table. Now this is you'll see this common throughout. If you look at what was common and kind of trending in the early 19th century in European fashion, you'll see turbans. But a lot of those turbans, the difference between a turban that was common and appropriated into European style is that usually those were sewn and they were kind of on hat bases, whereas head wraps are tied onto the head. Next slide. So we're going to take a look at mid-19th century and probably some that you've seen before. Next slide. So I know this is so fuzzy. It's probably a bit fuzzy. You can't really see it very well, but this is an unknown photographer around 1850, and this is considered to be one of the earliest images of enslaved persons. It's been colored after the fact. And they are wearing head wraps. Next slide. So I look at a lot of images of enslaved caretakers and enslaved nannies, like this image here. It was very common when we're looking at the mid-19th century that, again, very, very much starched, but you usually see a little bit of hair showing on the bottom there. You'll see this over and over again. Next slide. Again, this is covering the forehead, and then you'll see a little bit of hair on the bottom there. One of the purposes of head wraps is when you're working to protect your forehead from the sun, protect your hair from the sun, but also to collect sweat while you're working. Basically, a sweatband. Next slide. You'll see another very, very similar head wrap here. Next slide. I found this image very, very interesting because I believe that her head wrap is a salvage shawl and not a fabric meant to make clothing or even a kerchief. I think that this is a cut up shawl that she's using as a head wrap because I've seen this this pattern on a shawl many times before. I could be wrong, but that's what I think it is. Next slide. Again, these are people, these are contraband. So these people have, technically they are free at this point, but they are still on the place where they were enslaved. And you'll notice some similarities in the way in which these women have tied their head wrap. And a lot of them, two of them, have tied it to the right side of their, I think, the left side of their head. And that is, I don't see that a great deal, so it's quite unique. Next slide. So you'll see similarities between people in plantations as well as fabrics. And then in just this image, you'll see 5 different ways in which women are tying their head wraps. And you'll see a few different lengths of head wraps as well. Both this image and the image before are on the Library of Congress. Please, please, please go look at it, because you can really zoom in and get a really close look at the head wraps of these women. Next slide. Again, we're seeing a lot of similarities. These women are wearing necklaces. Please go to the Library of Congress. I have provided the information underneath the image, so you'll be able to locate it. They are wearing similar adornment, the necklaces they're wearing, as well as very similar fabric for the head wrap. I believe these may have been allotted before their liberation. Next slide. This is a bit later. These are 1900s. However, this is such a common mid-19th century head wrap that I had to share this. If you look at close up to this image, this is the most common way in which I've seen enslaved and free Black women post-enslavement tying their hair. And this is just simply either a triangle or a square kerchief folded in half, folded into a triangle, and then tied and brought around and tied up front. Sometimes they leave the two tails up. She's left the two tails. Sometimes they tuck one, leave one out, or tuck both. And then they fold up the rest into the fold in the back there. And you can kind of see that bulge there. Next slide. This is one of my favorite images. And this one, where is this one? Yes, this is a Danish West Indies image. And this is a Madras fabric as well. Next slide. And remember, I told you that you will see them adorning head wraps with lace and jewels. This is a great example. If you take a very, very close look, you will notice that this woman has pinned brooches to her head wrap, and it has lace on it. I believe that she probably took a larger piece of fabric and then sewed lace trim onto it. Next slide. Now, I really wanted to share, and to close this up, I really wanted to show how we came full circle. Next slide. So for the longest period of time after enslavement, there was a period of time where Black women, you would not see a Black woman in a head wrap outside of work or outside of her house, because head wraps were also tied to the idea of enslavement or status. Even though both enslaved and free Black women wore kerchiefs and head wraps, it really had that negative connotation of enslavement attached to it. So for a long time, Black women refused to wear head wraps outside their home, but they still, I have to tell you, Black women have continued to wear head wraps from enslavement to today, because it is very important to hair care for Black American women, whether you see it or not. Either the silk head wrap or now the bonnet. So when we come to the 1970s with the Black Power movement, you start in the 60s and 70s, you see a revival of the head wrap, especially with Nina Simone. And Nina Simone starts to popularize it once again with Black women. But again, Black women were always wearing head wraps at home. She wore it outside, and she did receive a lot of comments. Why are you wearing that head rag out? And you can even see interviews where she talks about this. Next slide. I'm looking at the time and I know I'm going over. Okay, so looking at the 90s and 2000s, artists like Erykah Badu and Lauryn Hill, India.Arie popularized colorful and towering head wraps for the new generation. This is the era that I came up in. I grew up in the 1990s, and these were the women I looked up to. And at home, I was seeing my family members wearing head wraps in the home and then taking it off. In fact, my mom was very appalled when I started wearing head wraps outside the home because it just wasn't done. But because of people like Erykah Badu, India.Arie, and Lauryn Hill, it became more socially acceptable for Black women to wear head wraps outside their home. But it really wouldn't get really mainstream for Black women until today, the 2020s. And they also started to explore the rich history of head wraps. This was the time where Black women were starting to look back at Africa and the importance of head wraps throughout the diaspora. Next slide. Okay. So the 2010s, when we start to see a lot of Black women transitioning away from chemical relaxers, chemically straightening their hair. I myself have permanent chemical burns on my scalp from chemical relaxers. While I support Black women's choice for however they do their hair, I prefer a safer method. And to me, that is no relaxers. So in the 2010s, you saw a lot of women, Black women, going away from chemical relaxers. And it was the beginning of the natural hair care movement, which actually has gone mainstream in the past few years. But it was Black women in search for how can they go from chemically straightening their hair to loving their natural hair texture, how it grows out of their head, that they started that movement, especially women with tightly coiled hair like myself. So you saw a lot of new YouTubers, and along with that, you saw hundreds of tutorials on how to wrap your hair. Because this, again, instead of it being associated with shame around enslavement, it was pride and connecting to heritage. So when you see Black women wearing head wraps, you will find, if you ask them, a lot of them will say this is an expression of their heritage through this head wrap, as well as just, protecting my hair from all the things that I go through in a work day. Next slide. Next, yeah. It is more, again, as I said before, it's more than just a fashion statement. A lot of Black women have connected with their African roots through starting to wrap their hair. And some women are engaging with women from Africa, throughout West Africa, to learn how to tie their hair. But there's always more learning to do. So that's something that Not Your Mama's History is helping to make these connections with people. I know I went over a bit. Next slide. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, especially to the Patreons, because they are constantly sending me more images and connecting me with new sites who have more images and paintings to help with my research. I think in conclusion, I always ask myself, what is the purpose of all this? Why did I just spend the past hour talking to you about head wraps? At the end of the day, why does it matter? I think it matters because head wraps are a window into the world of enslaved women. You cannot talk about head wraps without talking about the laws that govern their lives, without talking about why, how, in order to get a silk kerchief after she worked a full day in the field or a full day in a factory for no money, she went home and planted a garden or cared for chickens and then took those chickens to market to purchase fabric for better fabric for her family and herself. All these things matter to show a full, complete story of these people. They were not just slaves. These were people with agency and creativity. And through this lecture, I hope that I introduce them to you in a little better way than I was introduced to them. Right. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I have some questions in the Q&A, and I think we have time for just one or two, if that's all right.
Yes, I'm so sorry for so long.
No, it was fascinating. We're super excited to just be learning new things, and so that is great. So we have a question in the chat. Would indentured servants and convict servants wear similar head wraps to enslaved people?
No.
No.
Number one, indentured servants, they were not legal property, and they would be quick to tell people this. So they would attempt to differentiate themselves from enslaved persons. Now, I do see people of mixed heritage wearing head wraps, but I find that a lot of indentured servants would not want to identify themselves as enslaved persons or of African descent, because as horrible as the life as indentured servants had it, and the abuses they suffered were many. This was not a walk in the park. Indentured servitude was a contract, and there was an end in sight. And if not for you, your children. And with enslaved persons, with hereditary chattel slavery, that person is enslaved, their children are enslaved, and so on and so forth, and it's marked by their skin. So even though indentured servants were most of the time still wearing Negro cloth, because it was just cheap fabric that enslavers were purchasing in bulk, so everybody was wearing that, they would not want to identify themselves as such. Again, Louisiana area may be different. That is not my field of research, but there are many people who do amazing scholarship on that.
Another question we have is for Black presenters for living history sites set in the 1870s and 80s in the Midwest. Do you have suggestions for how to style hair and if a head wrap is appropriate for that region and time?
Okay, the Midwest. I would say, depending on where you are and how settled the area, what type of life they're living will determine what they're doing with their hair. By the 1870s and 80s, you can look up the African American Museum in DC. I need to remember the whole name. I'm sorry, y'all. I don't remember the real name. I just to let you all know, I am jet lagged right now. Um, I do not remember the full name of the museum, but the African American History Museum, yes, the National Museum. Thank you very much. The National Museum of African American History and Culture. Yes, they have so many images in their collection online. They have digitized it. They have scanned them. So you can look at those images. If you want to do a historic style, you can. I think a lot of those women would have shorn their hair completely off, because even white women with fine hair were having a lot of trouble actually keeping up with their hair. So for Black women, it would have been very, very challenging. So I would say a head wrap, or shorn hair, very short, and head wrap, or try a historical hairstyle. You do see it in images, but I'm not sure. I'm just thinking about the lack of resources in certain areas, and just the sheer amount of work that everyone had to do, and just the amount of work that went into Black hair care then and now. I don't know. I don't think that they were out there um, with the bangs.
Yeah. So what publications or online resources can you recommend to someone who is newly researching and learning about historical African clothing and modes of fashion?
Um, I I personally would just recommend starting with looking at images. The Library of Congress is chock full of the WPA narratives, where you can go and actually read accounts where people describe um, clothing, as well as looking at the images that they have there. Just be aware, there's so many images online where they label people as enslaved, or even label, a lot of images are just labeled wrong. So just make sure you're doing your due diligence and really tracing where images are coming from. So the Library of Congress is really helpful, because it's well documented, um, as well as the National Museum in DC.
Great. I think we have one more. I think it was in relation to one of the images you showed. Somebody said, "Thank you for the presentation and these amazing images. Do you know if the three Dominicans in the painting are in Dominica or in the DR or the DR?"
Wait, let me let me look that up.
Sorry.
Don't
Probably
worry.
should have caught that one at the time that you had the image up.
No, it's my fault for Xing out of my notes. My bad, y'all. But I have a slow connection, so I'm slowly making my way back. Um I apologize for this, you all.
No, it's quite all right. Maybe while you're doing that, we can ask one more question.
Mhm.
Uh, let's see. How common was it for enslavers to allow those enslaved to have a source of income, as you mentioned? Which regions of North America was that more common in?
Okay. Um, Actually, all over. So It really was a case by case. So enslavers, I find, wanted to get away with giving their enslaved property as little as possible of their profits as they could get away with. Um, Even when people are considered to be, a quote unquote good slave owner, which there's no such thing as a good slave owner, they were really just trying to get away with giving the bare minimum, whether so they could appear as decent and noble people, or so that they could get away with just as much profits as possible. So I find that with allotments, they're not giving the most. And so they're trying to make sure their enslaved persons are being fed, so that they could keep profit without having to shell out too much. So if an enslaved person is hunting, that's good for them because that's less meat they have to give them. If their enslaved person is selling chickens, again, they don't have to worry about, oh, I don't have to really worry about them having an extra winter coat or an extra winter petticoat because they're going to cover that, which, might I add, these people are not usually being paid. However, some enslaved persons were paid. Slavery does not mean that you are doing work for free. Slavery means that you cannot leave, that you are property. That is the status. So some enslaved persons were paid, some enslaved persons were wearing silk. So yes, I do think it's very, very common for that enslavers allowed their enslaved to have side hustles. Now, they could always revoke that if they feel that their extracurricular activities were impacting their main jobs, or if they got a bee in their bonnet and their endeavors were very successful. I've seen this many times where an enslaver tanks an enslaved person's business because they were, number one, worried that they would run away with that money or use it to purchase family members. So always remember that legally, any money that this person makes can be taken away at any point by their enslaver because they are property, and any and all their property is their property.
Thank you so much for this. It's been very enlightening. I really appreciate you coming in and talking with us. I hope that everyone enjoyed this talk. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue to offer free public programming. Gifts in any amount are appreciated. I would like to remind you that this was the first of 3 lectures that we are doing in our Talking About Race Matters Join the Conversation series. Join us here next Wednesday, February 21st at 6 p.m. on Zoom for Fashion, Race, Identity, and Power, Black Dandy Beginnings by Monica Miller. Be sure to register through the link in the chat and follow us on social media for updates. And thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. And again, thank you so much, Cheyney. This has been great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Good night.